And if you die tomorrow?
Arizona Territory, October of 1887. I came west hunting for land and peace, but what I found was freedom, waiting in the eyes of someone who saw me as a man, not a mistake. The wind cut like iron filings. 45 years I've lived under this kind of wind, and it still feels like the world reminding me I'm temporary. It blew across the hills that morning, carrying the taste of cold rain and old sorrow. Out here, the land has a long memory. It remembers what men try to forget. I was walking the north fence, same way I've done since I could stand straight. Checking posts, tightening wire, hammering staples. A man learns to fix fences because he can't fix himself. Work steadies the blood, gives you something honest to hold when your mind drifts too far into yesterday. The creek ran slow beside me, the color of iron and ash, whispering a song older than any of us. I had my gloves stiff with mud, my back stiff with years, and the kind of quiet that makes you listen to your own heartbeat. Then I saw something that didn't belong to the land, a stain dark against pale dust near the gate brace. Blood. Not animal blood, the smell was too sharp, too close to iron. The ground looked punched in, trampled by boots that didn't respect where they were standing. The gate leaned wrong, one hinge twisted, one bolt missing. My stomach dropped before my mind caught up. You don't live this long out here without recognizing trouble's handwriting. I walked closer, slow, hand resting on my revolver out of habit, not fear. The yard was silent, the kind of silence that hums in your bones. Bo, my horse, shifted behind me, uneasy. When a horse doesn't trust the air, you'd better start paying attention. Inside Gideon Flynn's cabin, the world had stopped. The door hung half-broken, letting the light fall in crooked. Chairs overturned, a lantern shattered, blood smeared on the floor like someone had tried to wipe away shame and failed. And there, by the hearth, lay Gideon. His chest rose shallow, his face gray as winter bark. "Jude," he rasped when I knelt beside him. That voice, once strong enough to move cattle and men alike, now barely scratched the air. "I'm here," I said. My voice came out rougher than I meant it. "Don't try to talk. Oh, sex." He smiled a painful kind of smile that meant he knew exactly how bad it was. They came again, Briggs and his boys. 7 this time. Said I should sell. Said the land don't belong to one man anymore. "And you told them it still does," I said quietly. He nodded, then coughed, and the cough turned red. Guess they disagreed. I pressed a wet cloth to his mouth. My hands aren't as steady as they used to be, but they remembered how to help. I saw the shape of his ribs, beneath the shirt broken, caved. Too much damage for one man to patch. I should have ridden for a doctor right then, but a voice inside me said it wouldn't matter. Not because I didn't care, but because men like Briggs don't stop with bones. They come back to finish what they start. "Where's Cassidy?" I asked. "Gone," he said. "Northeast. Said he's going to find Natan." That name hung heavy between us. Natan, the Apache leader Gideon once saved years back, when a flash flood took half a canyon and almost a boy with it. Gideon pulled that boy out and carried him through rain and rock till dawn. Never spoke much about it after, but I'd seen the bond that followed. Once or twice a year, Natan's riders came quiet, proud, shared food, no words wasted. That kind of respect is rare, between men who carry different histories. "He shouldn't have gone alone," I said. "Boy's stubborn," Gideon whispered. "Gets that from his mother. Thinks the world still keeps its promises." I didn't answer. The fire cracked, the only heartbeat in the room besides his. I wanted to tell him help was coming. But out here, help's a ghost that visits the rich and skips the rest of us. "You need rest," I said finally. He laughed once, weak. "Rest when I'm done owing this world." His eyes closed halfway. "You ever notice, Jude? Men like Briggs don't believe in the land, just the price tag." I nodded, though I wasn't sure he could still see me. "Yeah," I said. "I've noticed." I stayed there a while, long enough to watch the light shift across his face, long enough for guilt to take root in my chest. When I finally stood, my knees popped like gunfire. I straightened the room as best I could, set the chairs upright, closed the busted door, covered him with a blanket that smelled of smoke and years. Then I stepped outside. The air hit me hard. It always does after a man bleeds inside. The sky was clean, too clean, like the kind that doesn't care what happens under it. I looked east and west and saw nothing but distant red hills rolling into blue haze. I'd spent a lifetime trying to make peace with this land, but in that moment, I hated it. Hated how it stayed beautiful while men turned ugly. I saddled Bo. The leather creaked, the sound of old faith still holding. I thought about going to town, fetching the dock, but I knew the math. 2 days there and back, maybe 3, and by then Briggs would be back to finish the job. There was only one chance, and she lived somewhere between the cottonwoods and the silence beyond. Ayanna. The first time I met her, she was 16, fierce-eyed and quiet, selling herbs outside the mercantile. Some fool called her a name he shouldn't have, and I did nothing. Just stood there, watching her face harden into the kind of calm that scares men. I've regretted that silence longer than I've regretted anything else. Funny thing about age, you can bury mistakes deep, but they keep finding their way back to daylight. If anyone could reach Natan, it'd be her. And if she turned me away, I'd ride alone anyway. Not for revenge, for balance. I mounted Bo, turned toward the North Pass, where the sky grew narrow and mean. My shadow stretched long behind me, like it didn't want to follow. Every hoofbeat echoed against rock, each one asking the same question, "What are you still doing here, old man?" Maybe I didn't have an answer. Maybe I just couldn't stand the thought of another good man dying because someone else wanted more. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway, to keep more Wild West love stories coming. The sun dipped low, the color of worn copper. I followed the creek until it split into 3 shallow veins, the water whispering secrets about what had happened and what was coming. Somewhere ahead, a hawk screamed, sharp and lonely. I took it as a warning or maybe a welcome. By dusk, I reached the ridge, where the land folds into Apache country. No maps here, no markers, just instinct and memory, the kind of place that swallows men who come uninvited. I reined in, let Bo rest, and listened. You can tell a lot from how the night settles, how the wind holds its breath before company. That's when I saw her. Ayanna stepped out from the trees, reins loose in her hand, the setting sun tangled in her hair. She looked at me like time had never passed, and maybe it hadn't. Her face was calm, but her eyes knew. She always did. "Walker," she said softly, using the name I'd left behind years ago. "Ayanna," I answered. "Didn't expect you'd still remember." "Some names stay," she said. "Some debts, too." She looked past me toward the valley, toward the smoke still rising from Gideon's place. I didn't need to explain much. "Briggs," she said. I nodded. She sighed once, low. "Men like that don't fear the law. Only stories. Then maybe it's time we give them one worth fearing." Her gaze lingered on me a moment longer. Me, the old fool trying to set something right with hands too tired for another fight. Finally, she nodded. "Follow me," she said. "But remember, once we ride that ridge, you don't speak, you listen." "I can do that," I said. "Can you?" she asked, half a smile ghosting her lips. "You've been talking to yourself for 40 years. She turned her horse and led the way. I followed, the wind biting at my coat, the smell of wood smoke fading behind us. Ahead lay the hills, the hidden canyons, and whatever waited beyond the reach of fences. Maybe redemption, maybe the end of the road. Either way, I was ready to meet it. The trail that led to Natan's camp wasn't made by men, it was carved by wind and bones. The canyon walls narrowed until the sky looked like a blue thread sewn between cliffs. Every sound echoed, hooves, breath, the jingle of my stirrup against Bo's side. Ayanna rode ahead, her posture quiet and sure, like she was part of the land instead of trespassing through it. I'd ridden with soldiers, outlaws, and cowhands who bragged more than they breathed, but I'd never met anyone who carried silence like she did. It wasn't shyness, it was weight, the kind of stillness that comes from knowing too much and saying too little. We rode half a day without a word. The hills around us changed color as we climbed. Ochre to rust, rust to the pale white of bone. The air smelled like rain and juniper. Somewhere high above, a hawk made slow circles, patient as judgment. When the first drop of rain hit my sleeve, Ayana finally spoke. "Your horse is tired," she said. "So am I told her. "But neither of us plans to quit." She looked over her shoulder, one eyebrow raised just slightly. "Still, think pride makes a man strong?" "Used to," I said. "Now I think it just makes him lonely." That almost earned a smile from her, almost. Then she turned forward again. The path dipped into a narrow gorge where water ran thin as wire between stones. The sky went gray fast, rain whispering across the rocks. I pulled my coat tight and tried not to think about the last time I'd ridden this far into Apache land. It had been 20 years earlier, back when the army paid men like me to draw lines through other men's homes. We called it surveying. They called it stealing. I'd never said no to an order back then, and that silence cost me more than I care to count. Maybe that's why I followed Ayana now. Some debts don't belong to any one man, but to a whole kind of people. By nightfall, the rain eased. We stopped under a cliff where the stone jutted out just enough to make a roof. Ayana built a small fire, her hands quick and practiced. The smell of smoke mixed with sage. She handed me a piece of dried venison and a flask of water. "You don't talk much," I said. She poked the fire with a stick. "Words don't change what a man already decided." You think I've already decided?" She looked at me across the flame. "You wouldn't be here if you hadn't. But you don't ride for revenge. I can see that." I nodded slowly. "I ride so Gideon Flynn can see another sunrise. That's all." Her eyes softened then, but only a little. "Natan remembers him. My father spoke of that flood. Said the white man who carried the boy back from the river had arms like the mountain and eyes that didn't look down on anyone." I looked into the fire. "That sounds like Gideon." She tilted her head. "And you, Jude Walker, what are you?" I took a long breath. The rain outside turned to mist, curling like smoke between us. A man who forgot what honor felt like, trying to remember before it's too late. For a while, the only sound was the fire. Then Ayana leaned back against the rock, eyes half closed. "You'll see him soon, but he will test you first. He tests everyone who crosses that ridge." "I'd expect nothing less." She nodded. "Good, because when we stand before Natan, you won't speak unless he asks. You'll keep your hands open and your eyes steady. He'll know what kind of man you are before you say a word." "Doesn't seem fair," I said. "Fair?" she echoed. "Fairness is a word men use when they've already had their share." That shut me up. The night deepened. Coyotes called from far-off, lonely sound, familiar. I thought of Gideon lying in that dark cabin, and of his son, riding somewhere ahead of us. Maybe he'd already reached Natan. Maybe he was bones on the trail. Out here, hope and dread wear the same face. Sometime after midnight, I woke to find Ayana still awake, feeding the fire small branches. The light painted her face in gold and shadow. She wasn't young, not the way I remembered from years ago, but there was something timeless in the way she sat still, like the land itself had chosen her. "You should sleep," I said quietly. She didn't look up. "Sleep makes the past louder." I know that sound," I murmured. "Used to wake me every night. The things I didn't say. The men I didn't save." Her eyes lifted to mine, then steady, unflinching. "Then you understand why you're here. Not to save someone. To listen." She let the last branch burn out. The fire died to red coals, and with it, my need to talk. We slept, or tried to, while the wind changed direction. By dawn, the clouds had moved east. We saddled the horses and rode again. The canyon opened into a valley dotted with sage and stone huts, smoke rising from their roofs. I knew before she said a word we were close. My heart kicked like it hadn't in years. "Keep your hand down," Ayana whispered. "Show them peace." Two riders appeared from behind a rise. They came fast, silent, rifles resting across their arms. Their horses barely made a sound on the dry ground. When they stopped 10 feet away, the younger one spoke in Apache. Ayana answered in the same tongue, her voice calm but firm. The older warrior studied me, eyes like flint. Then he pointed at my revolver. I unbuckled it and placed it on the ground. He nodded once and spoke again. Ayana turned to me. He says Natan will see you. But you walk. I dismounted, legs stiff, the ache of years and guilt fighting for attention. They led us through the camp. Women looked up from their work. Children paused mid-play. No fear in their faces, only curiosity. They'd seen men like me before, maybe too many times. At the center stood a large fire, and beside it, a man taller than I remembered, hair streaked with gray, eyes dark as obsidian. Natan. Time had carved him into something solid, like the mountains behind him. He didn't speak right away, just studied me the way a man studies weather before it breaks. Then he said, in English, slow and clear, "You ride with Ayana. That means you come in peace." Why? I met his gaze. Because Gideon Flynn's dying. The camp went still. Even the horses outside the circle stopped moving. Natan's jaw tightened. Briggs? I nodded. He lives still? For now. Natan looked toward the east, where the hills bled into sky. My people remember the debt your friend earned, but debts are rivers, they change course. I know, I said quietly. But this one runs deep. You decide if it still flows. Something flickered in his eyes, then recognition. Maybe memory. He motioned for someone to bring water. Then, softer, you are old, Jude Walker. Why come yourself? Because I owe Gideon more than a visit to his grave. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion. Then he spoke to his people in Apache, voice low but commanding. Warriors began to move, gathering weapons, saddles, food. The camp turned from quiet to purpose. Ayana stepped beside him. You ride? She asked. Natan's mouth curved faintly. The boy came before dawn. His father still breathes. We ride for the Flynn Ranch before the sun falls again. The old chief turned back to me. You brought the past to our fire, Walker. We will carry it with you. But understand, once we ride, the story belongs to all of us. I bowed my head. Then let's make it one worth telling. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. Dawn came the way truth does, slow, quiet, and impossible to ignore. The first light slid down the cliffs, washing the camp in pale gold. Smoke from the dying fires coiled into the cold air like prayers that didn't know where to land. Men moved through it without a sound, tying saddles, checking rifles, whispering to horses who already understood what the day would bring. I've seen men ride to war before loud, drunk on pride and fear. But this was different. There was no anger here, only certainty. The Apache didn't ride for revenge. They rode because a debt had come due, and honor doesn't sleep through its calling. Natan stood at the ridge's edge, his breath white against the morning. He wasn't dressed for battle, no paint, no feathers, no show. Just a coat worn smooth by weather and time, and eyes that held a kind of silence no young man could understand. Ayana moved among the warriors, handing each one a small pouch of sage and tobacco, murmuring blessings in her tongue. The smoke of her words rose and disappeared into the dawn. I watched them and realized how small my world had been. Fences, fields, fences again. These people moved with the land, not against it. They didn't claim it. They listened to it. Maybe that's why it kept their secrets. I saddled Bo, feeling the weight of every year in my bones. You ready, old boy? I whispered. He flicked his ear, the same answer he always gave. When I turned, Ayana was there. She tied a strip of blue cloth around my wrist. It's for belonging, she said. I'm not sure I've earned that. Then wear it until you do. Natan raised his hand. The camp went still. Then he spoke a few words, low, steady, and 400 men mounted as one. The sound of hooves struck the ground like thunder learning discipline. We rode out single file, the rising sun catching on the rifle barrels like a promise. The first day's ride was long and wordless. We cut through valleys of red dust and tall grass, across rivers thin as silver threads. Coyotes watched us from the ridges, ghosts of old stories, waiting to be rewritten. The rhythm of the horses beat steady under me, a sound that took me back to younger days when I still believed justice had a uniform. Ayana rode a few lengths ahead, her braid dark against the morning. She never looked back, but she didn't have to. Some people lead without trying. Natan rode near the front, his figure sharp against the horizon. I found myself wondering what kind of boy he'd been, the one Gideon saved from the flood. Maybe he'd been afraid then. Maybe he'd learned what fear was good for. By the second sunset, we reached the edge of Flynnland. From the ridge, I could see the cabin, small, square, stubborn. Smoke curled from the chimney. He was still alive. Gideon Flynn refused to die on anyone's schedule but his own. We camped in the dry creek bed a mile away. The warriors spread in a half circle, hidden under sage and rock. Fires burned low, just enough for warmth. Natan walked the perimeter, silent, memorizing the ground like a map carved in his mind. When he came back, he stopped beside me. "They'll come at dawn," he said. "They said a week," I answered. "Briggs keeps time like a banker." "Run." "Then dawn it will be." Ayanna joined us, sitting cross-legged near the fire. The glow caught her face, softer now that the ride was over. "You afraid?" she asked. I smiled faintly. At my age, fear's just another friend who overstayed his welcome. She tilted her head. "And if you die tomorrow? Then I hope someone else keeps the fences straight." That made her laugh, a quiet, unexpected sound that rolled through the dark like mercy. The night passed slow. I didn't sleep. The stars were too loud, the silence too deep. Around me, warriors rested with weapons close, breath steady. I envied their peace. I kept seeing Gideon's broken ribs, the blood, the way his son's voice must have cracked when he rode for help. When you live long enough, you start carrying other people's ghosts. They ride behind your eyes, whispering what you could have done better. When dawn came, I was already on my feet. The horizon burned red. Ayanna stood beside her horse, tightening the cinch. "They're coming," she said. I didn't ask how she knew. The air had changed heavier, like a storm thinking twice. Then we heard them. 7 riders, moving slow and sure from the east, the same ones who had broken Gideon. Briggs led them, clean coat, trimmed beard, eyes cold enough to cut glass. Behind him, 6 men who still believed cruelty was strength. We waited until they were close. Natan gave one nod. 400 men rose from the earth. The moment was soundless, unreal, the kind of silence that makes even wind forget how to move. Briggs froze mid-step, his hand halfway to his holster. His horse snorted, sensing the shift. The men beside him looked around, saw nothing but eyes and barrels in every direction. Natan stepped forward. The air seemed to part for him. "You beat an old man," he said, voice low but carrying. "You thought him alone." Briggs tried to smile, failed halfway. "We didn't come for you. You came for what isn't yours. That makes it ours." Briggs swallowed hard. "You kill us, and you'll bring the army." Natan didn't blink. "Then we'll greet them the same way." He raised his hand. Arrows lifted in unison, hundreds of them, their tips catching the new Sunday. Briggs's mouth went dry. He looked at me then, desperate for a face he recognized. "Walker," he said, "tell him we can talk this through." I shook my head. "You had your say when you raised your hands against a dying man." Gideon's cabin door opened behind me. The old rancher stood there, wrapped in a blanket, pale but upright. "Enough," he croaked. "Let them go. I don't want more blood on this land." Natan's eyes met his. "You still choose mercy." "I choose peace," Gideon said. "Let them carry their fear instead of their dead." Natan nodded once. He turned back to Briggs. "Ride east. Don't stop until the mountains hide you. If you come back, not even your bones will find rest." Briggs hesitated a heartbeat too long. Then he mounted, hands shaking. His men followed. When they were gone, the wind returned, soft at first, then steady, carrying away their dust and the sound of their defeat. We stayed like that for a long moment, no one speaking. Then Natan turned to Gideon. "You've kept your word," he said. "The land still breathes your name." Gideon's lips trembled into something close to a smile, then let it keep breathing a while longer. The warriors began to move again, taking down blinds, gathering arrows. The field that had held war an hour ago looked ordinary once more, like the land had swallowed the memory whole. Ayanna walked toward me, brushing dust from her coat. "You did nothing," she said. "That's the point," I told her. "Sometimes," she said softly, "doing nothing is the bravest thing." I looked out across the valley. The sun climbed higher, lighting the hills in gold. For the first time in a long while, the world didn't feel like it was leaning against me. Natan gave orders for a perimeter watch, then walked past me, pausing just long enough to say, "The river remembers what flows through it. So do we." I nodded. Words felt too small for what had just passed. That night, the Apache camped around the ranch, torches burning in quiet circles of light. No celebration, no boasting, just presence. When I finally sat by the fire, Bo lay nearby, ears twitching in his sleep. The smoke smelled like sage and peace. Ayana sat across from me, sharpening a knife she might never need. The glow of the flames caught her eyes, and for a moment I saw in them what I had lost somewhere along the years, a belief that not every man was beyond redemption. Maybe that was freedom after all. Not the kind you fight for. The kind you're given when someone chooses to see you different. Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. Your body will thank you. When the dust settled, the land didn't sing. It just breathed slow, steady, alive again. The Apache camped around the Flynn Ranch for 3 days, though no one said exactly why. Maybe it was to make sure Briggs and his kind stayed gone. Maybe it was because leaving right away would feel like turning their backs on something sacred. Either way, I was grateful for it. The first morning after the standoff, the air smelled of rain. The hills wore that soft light that makes even scars look gentle. I woke to the sound of horses and children, small laughter cutting through the heavy quiet that had hung over this place for too long. It was strange peace always feels louder after violence. Ayana was near the corral, showing 2 young boys how to brush down a mare. She moved like patience given form. I watched her from the porch, coffee cooling in my hand, wondering how a woman who'd seen so much loss could still teach with such tenderness. Natan spent most of the day walking the boundary lines with Gideon's son, Cassidy. The boy had fire in him, but I saw in his steps that he was learning restraint, the kind that only men who've seen death up close can carry. Gideon stayed inside, his ribs still bound, his strength flickering in and out like a lantern in wind. I helped where I could, small things mostly, fixing the door I'd once found hanging from its hinges, cutting wood, hauling water. No one asked me to, but work gives old hands something to say when words fall short. By afternoon, Ayana came to me with a small clay bowl. "For his pain," she said. Inside was a paste that smelled of cedar and smoke. "You made this?" I asked. She nodded. "My grandmother taught me. It cools the fire under the skin." I carried it inside. Gideon lay propped up near the window, eyes following the shadows that moved across the floor. He smiled when he saw me. "Thought you'd ridden off already," he said. "Not yet. I figured the land's got enough ghosts without adding mine." He chuckled, winced. "Hell, Jude, you've been a ghost since you quit believing in people." He wasn't wrong. I'd lived like a man halfway buried for years, alive in body, dead in trust. I knelt beside him, set the bowl down. "She made this, said it might help." He sniffed it. "Smells like the earth before rain. Guess that's medicine enough." When I spread it over the bruises, he hissed, but the tension in his body eased after a while. "You ever wonder," he said quietly, "why folks like Natan still help men like us after all the wrong we've done them? Because mercy's the only thing rarer than water out here," I said. He stared out the window, eyes glassy with something deeper than pain. "Maybe so. Or maybe they just remember better than we do." That evening, the camp filled with smoke and stories. The Apache gathered near the main fire, sharing food, laughter, and long silences that said more than any words could. I sat at the edge of the circle, half in shadow, half in flame. Ayana passed me a plate of roasted corn and smiled without saying a thing. I'd forgotten what quiet kindness felt like. It doesn't ask, doesn't take, it just is. Someone began to sing then, a low, steady rhythm that pulsed like the heart of the land itself. I didn't understand the words, but I felt them. They told of storms survived, of debts repaid, of people who endure not by fighting, but by standing. Ayana's voice joined in, soft but strong, threading through the others like a stream through stone. And for the first time in a long while, I felt clean inside. Not forgiven, just clean. There's a difference. Later, when the fire had burned low, Natan came to sit beside me. His face was a map of years and choices. "You carry too much," he said simply. I smiled tiredly. "That's what old men do best." He shook his head. "Old men remember, yes, but carrying is different. Carrying makes the remembering heavy." He looked toward the dark hills where the wind was rising again. "The world changes, Walker, but it still needs men who choose honor over comfort." "I tried that once," I said. "Didn't end well. Maybe because you tried it alone." He rose then, motioning toward the fire where Ayanna sat listening to the children. "You think she's alone? The land watches her. The wind speaks her name. That's not solitude. That's belonging." I watched her silhouette in the light and understood what he meant. There's a freedom that comes not from taking, but from being trusted enough to give something back. When Natan walked away, I stayed a long time by that dying fire. The stars above the valley were sharp as nails, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting to die. The next morning, Gideon was strong enough to stand. Ayanna helped him outside, her arm steady around his waist. The sight of it made me think of something I'd forgotten, that pride has nothing to do with how straight a man stands, only how honest he walks. "You did it, old friend," I said. He shook his head. "No, we did it. Or maybe the land did, through us." He looked at Ayanna. "I owe you more than I can pay." She met his gaze square. "You owe nothing. You gave what mattered most respect." That word sat heavy in the air. It's the kind of word you don't use unless you mean it. Natan came to the porch later, the morning sun painting him in bronze and shadow. "We leave tomorrow," he said. "The land has seen enough soldiers for a season." "Will you come back?" Gideon asked. Natan smiled faintly. "If the wind calls me, but the debt is done." He looked to me next. "And you, Walker, what will you do when we're gone?" I looked out over the fields, the fences, the sky so wide it almost forgave you for being small. "Maybe start listening again," I said. "The world's been talking this whole time. I just stopped hearing." Natan nodded. "Then you'll do fine." He turned to leave, but Ayanna stayed. "You'll keep that cloth?" she asked, nodding to my wrist. "Till it frays," I said. She smiled. "Good. When it does, come find me. The wind will know the way." Len. Something in her tone made me think she meant it. That night was still. No coyotes, no wind, just the sound of horses shifting and the slow beat of peace. I sat by the window while Gideon slept, watching the campfires flicker across the yard. I thought of all the years I'd spent trying to own things, land, pride, silence, and how none of it ever filled the hollow in my chest. Then I thought of these past 3 days and how simple it really was. All a man ever needed was someone to look him in the eye and see a person worth saving. When I finally lay down, I slept deep and dreamless. In the morning, the Apache were gone. No dust, no sound, no trace, only flattened grass and the faint smell of cedar where their fires had been. The world looked the same, but I wasn't. Ayanna's blue cloth still wrapped my wrist, warm from the Sunday. I touched it and smiled. Freedom had a texture after all, rough, worn, and real. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. Morning came without fanfare, soft and gray, like the world taking its first breath after holding it too long. The Apache were gone. No smoke, no hoofprints, no sound, just an emptiness that wasn't really empty. More like a quiet that still remembered who had passed through. I stood at the porch, coffee in hand, watching the horizon burn faintly gold. Gideon sat in his chair near the window, the blanket over his knees, and Cassidy was mending a broken fence post by the corral. The sound of his hammer echoed like the heart of the ranch beating again. It struck me that this was what victory looked like, not flags or cheers, just people breathing in peace, making small noises of life. I walked to the edge of the yard. The air was crisp with cedar and ash. For the first time in years, the land didn't feel like a burden to carry. It felt like something alive, watching us, weighing our worth, deciding maybe for now, we'd earned another day. Gideon called from the porch, voice stronger now. "You staying, Jude?" I smiled. "Where else would I go?" He nodded, satisfied. "Then grab a hammer. That fence still needs fixing." So I did. We worked until noon, 3 men under one sky, each mending something more than wood and wire. Gideon worked slower than before, but there was a stubborn joy in his movements. Cassidy moved quick, sure-handed, the way young men do when they've learned how close they came to losing everything. Sometimes I'd catch Gideon watching his son, pride tucked behind that rough old face. He'd nearly lost the boy to desperation, but desperation had brought salvation in a shape none of us expected. When we stopped for lunch, the sun was warm enough to sit without coats. Gideon poured coffee, the smell mixing with dust and wind. "Funny thing," he said, "the land looks bigger now." "It's always been this big," I said. "We just stopped seeing it." He looked at me for a long time. "You ever think you were meant to be here, Jude? Not as a ranch hand or a fighter just here to witness?" "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I just finally stopped running long enough for the world to catch up." He grinned. "That's the same thing, far as I can tell." Cassidy came over then, dirt streaked on his face. "I keep thinking about them," he said quietly. "The Apache, how they moved, how they looked at us, like we mattered but not more than anyone else." That's the trick of it," Gideon said. "They see balance, not ownership. Took me a lifetime to understand that." I nodded. "Some men spend their whole lives building fences. Others learn to leave gates open." Cassidy frowned. "You think they'll ever come back?" I looked east where the land folded into sky. Maybe not as warriors, but their presence won't fade. The wind's full of their stories now. That evening, the sun set heavy and orange. I walked the ridge where the Apache fires had burned. The grass was flattened, the scent of cedar still clinging to the soil. For a while, I stood there and listened to nothing but the hum of insects and the slow rhythm of my own breathing. Then I saw it, a single feather caught on a fence post, black-tipped, soft as breath. I don't know whose it was, but it felt like a sign left behind on purpose. I took it, slipped it into my hatband. Ayana's blue cloth still circled my wrist. Every time the wind touched it, I thought of her the way she had stood between worlds, without belonging to either, and yet somehow belonged more than anyone I'd ever known. Maybe that's what love looks like when you're old. It isn't fire or frenzy. It's understanding. It's the quiet knowing that someone out there saw the worst of you and didn't turn away. The next morning, I saddled Bo and rode out before dawn. Gideon was resting, Cassidy asleep by the hearth. I didn't leave a note, didn't need to. Some journeys don't require words. The world was cool and pale, and the stars hadn't yet given up the sky. I followed the same trail the Apache had taken north, the one that cut through the canyons like a vein. I didn't ride to find them. I just needed to feel the road again, to remind myself that the world was still wide, and I still had a place in it. The hills rolled under the morning light. Somewhere far ahead, I imagined Ayana's voice carried by the wind. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was something more. Either way, it was enough. I stopped by the creek where the water turned red with clay, dismounted, knelt, and let my hands sink into the current. The water was cold, biting. It stung and then soothed. Maybe that's how healing works. First the sting, then the calm. I thought about Gideon's words, about the debt that runs deeper than gold, about Natan's warning that once you ride for honor, you ride forever. I figured I could live with that, because maybe honor isn't a burden at all. Maybe it's the only thing that keeps you light enough to keep moving. The days that followed blurred into something gentle. I helped rebuild what was broken. We fixed the fences, cleared the fields, and planted new cottonwood near the creek. Gideon joked that maybe one day he'd rest under their shade, but I think he knew better. He wasn't done living yet. None of us were. Cassidy rode into town once a week for supplies. Said people looked at him different now, less like a boy, more like a man who carried stories worth listening to. That's what courage does. It changes how the world hears your footsteps. As for me, I stayed on. There was no reason to leave. Every morning I'd walk the perimeter, listen to the wind move through the grass, and think about how strange it was that after all these years of running, peace had finally found me by accident. It wasn't perfect. It never is. But it was enough. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments. Weeks later, a traveler passed through one of those talkative drifters